So thanks again to everyone who's joining us here today, whether through Zoom or through Facebook Live. So my talk is part of wider research that I've been doing on Philippine science fiction, which I've kind of condensed and slightly reworked for the purposes of this lecture. So this is Space Flights of Fancy, Outer Space Filipino Workers and Left Behind Children in Science Fiction, Filipino Fiction for Young Adults. Spaceflight is generally considered to be the classic theme in science fiction, or SF. And through it, the universe is made familiar, no longer unfathomable, uncognizable, but a place where sooner or later humans will dare to travel, point camcorders, and plant flags. Because of this, in the context of Anglophone SF, spaceflight often represents transcending imaginative boundaries, as humanity reaches for a universe brimming with possibilities and all the hope, excitement, and adventures that such possibility may bring. Yet, as Gabriella Lee observes in her reflection on the migrant workforce in Philippine SF, when Philippine SF borrows certain iconography and images from Anglophone SF megatext, which are defined as a common paradigm from which writers may draw without having to resort to exposition, these iconography and images are redeployed in different ways across these texts, rendering them as carriers of alternate meanings. In the case of spaceflight, Lee suggests that it is used to indicate the hopelessness of travel, a leave-taking in which there is slim to no chance of returning home, as it imagines the overseas Filipino worker, or OFW, in a position of powerlessness, of hopelessness, or of entrapment by forces beyond their understanding. This redeployment in Philippine SF is done to push back against the Bagong Bayani narrative espoused in dominant OFW discourse, which often frames OFW's desperation as bravery and their struggles as a mere backdrop to their heroism, with economic security serving as both the reward and justification for their struggles. I am interested in further exploring how spaceflight is redeployed when it intersects with the Philippine icon of the OFW by examining stories told not from the perspective of the migrant worker, but the children left behind in Philippine young adult, or YA, SF. While labor migration has its roots in the Spanish colonial period, the formal push for labor migration began with the 1974 Labor Code under the dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. and was introduced as a temporary intervention to deal with rising unemployment and eroding foreign reserves. Almost 50 years later, it is evident that this temporary intervention has shifted into something more permanent, with OFW remittances consistently accounting for at least 9% of the country's GDP. These remittances have also been described on multiple occasions as a lifeline to the Philippine economy, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. This culture of migration has further been cemented by the local level of job opportunities, which has made many Filipinos feel as if there is no other choice but to seek work abroad and to support their families and to secure a materially improved future. In the latest survey on overseas Filipinos conducted by the Philippine Statistics Authority, there were approximately 2.16 million Filipinos working abroad from April to September 2023, reaffirming the Philippines as one of the top labor exporting countries in the world and the highest per capita exporter of labor in Southeast Asia. Given that the majority of OFWs work in elementary occupations, service and sales, or service plant and machine operators and assemblers, most OFWs are unable to petition to bring their families with them abroad. As a result, in 2023, UNICEF estimated that the number of left behind children in the Philippines is anywhere from 2 million to 9 million. Interestingly, Artajo notes that children of OFWs are also more likely to follow in their parents' footsteps and become OFWs themselves someday. And as many as 64% of Filipino youths aspire to become OFWs someday due to government policies that promote labor export and the continued lack of local opportunities. Because of this reality, it is perhaps no surprise then that Pasis and Sunico observe that readers of Philippine YA literature are particularly interested in stories that deal with dreams of a better life abroad and the unique family dynamics that may emerge in OFW families. This paper examines how both are explored through the figure of the OFW, reimagined as the Outer-space Filipino Worker, and their left-behind children in the short stories The Series Girl by Lacan Umali and Fortitude by Eliza Victoria, which are both from science fiction, Filipino fiction for young adults. This book was one of the first SF anthologies written specifically for young adults and features 10 stories edited by Dean Francis Alfar and Kenneth Yu. It was published by the University of the Philippines Press in 2016. Through examining these stories, I posit that while Gareth Greenwell says that in the Anglophone SF megatext, spaceflight tends to deflate space and collapse time, as impossible distances are crossed sometimes as quickly as a fraction of a second, thanks to high-powered and high-speed technology like Star Trek's warp drive. These Philippine YA SF stories' use of spaceflight tend to expand space and time, in that they emphasize distance and the quality of time lost through extended time away. As families are separated for years, sometimes indefinitely, across not oceans, but the vast expanse of space. In these stories, the opacity and seeming impenetrability of this space can not only distort identity and relationships, but serve as a filter for various forms of propaganda, corruption, and violence. While these stories do not take place in full-fledged dystopias, they nonetheless borrow elements from the tradition of YA-SF dystopias, in that teens are offered portraits of their culture and generation that demythologize scientific advance, capitalism, and laissez-faire economics as moral imperatives. The spaceflight no longer speaks to the wealth and power of a nation capable of sustaining intergalactic travel, as it often does in Anglophone SF, but a nation still suffering from a weak economy that cannot afford to keep its own people within its shores. Through this, these Philippine YA SF stories also continue to demythologize the OFW as modern-day heroes and migration as the ultimate dream for a better tomorrow, and instead encourages Filipino young adults who are future decision makers in their own right to engage with OFW discourse more critically in the here and now, to make alternative futures possible someday. The term outer space Filipino worker first appears in Lacan Umali's The Series Girl. In the story, Margaret is 7 years old when her mother becomes an outer space Filipino worker to serve as a nurse for an American terraforming company on the asteroid Ceres. The story unfolds over the course of the mother's 10-year absence and ends when the mother finally returns home. Before Margaret's mother leaves, she receives an Ansible from the company, which is an SF device originally invented by Ursula K. Le Guin for instantaneous communication between 2 points, regardless of the distance between them. The Ansible then takes the place of the cell phone, which features prominently in many real and fictional OFW narratives, as it allows the OFW to maintain contact with their family back home. This communication is restricted, however, as Margaret's mother has only been allotted 8 hours of video chat and 15 messages a month, which means that Margaret is only able to speak to her mother for 2 hours every week. This, of course, provides only a tenuous connection between Margaret and her mother, and Umali explores the deterioration of Margaret and her mother's relationship through a series of birthday gifts. On Margaret's 8th birthday, her mother sends a dollhouse, much to Margaret's delight, and she kept kissing the Ansible screen the next time she talked to her mother. So, for Margaret's 9th birthday, her mother sends an even bigger dollhouse. But Margaret complains that she stopped playing with dolls a year ago. She prefers books now, fun mystery books. The next year, Margaret's mother sends a stack of Nancy Drew books, and Margaret once again kisses the Ansible screen in gratitude. But when her mother sends even more Nancy Drew books for her next birthday, her response was less than enthusiastic. When Margaret says that she prefers Lady Grace books now, her mother apologizes, saying that she honestly didn't know that Margaret stopped liking Nancy Drew. Margaret unthinkingly retorts, "If you were actually here, you would know." Margaret's mother is hurt by this and sends Margaret a message the next morning, telling her that everything I've done for you, Margaret, for the security of your future. I traveled this great distance just to make sure you're taken care of. I hope you realize that and give me some consideration. because I am also suffering a great deal and would also like to go home very much, but I can't. The problem is that Margaret does understand her mother's situation and motivations, but it also does not change the fact that her mother has become an abstraction to her. All she has is an idea of a mother, the memories of what her mother's like. But she knows the mother in her head isn't her real mother, and that her mother does not know the real her either. Because how can you form a meaningful relationship with someone you only see for 2 hours a week? Rather than becoming a tool for connection, the Ansible seems to make the growing distance between Margaret and her mother more apparent as they go from losing track of time during their initial calls to a teenage Margaret hurling coins as hard as she could against her closet door as soon as the Ansible screen went black because of her mother's inability to understand her. By Margaret's 12th birthday, her mother has stopped attempting to buy her birthday gifts altogether and instead opts to send Margaret 1,500 pesos in cash. Through this, Umali parallels the situation of many OFW families at the time. Like Margaret and her mother, Mark Anthony D. Abenir observes that contact between OFW parents and their children in the past have typically been limited, as international calls or data charges were so expensive for the OFW's limited budget that they might as well have been calls to space. And the cost of traveling regularly to and from the Philippines remains out of the question for many. Young and Bakani point out that these LFWs are often gone for years, sometimes decades, sometimes indefinitely, preferring to use their meager salaries to save up for tuition fees, because many Filipinos still believe higher education could help lift their children out of poverty, despite the fact that many of these LFWs possess high school diplomas and college degrees themselves, which were of little help in the job market. This lack of communication, of a relationship, accumulates and puts an incredible strain on both the OFW and the family they leave behind. Avenir asserts that such techie parenting is still not able to replace the emotional bond forged by daily face-to-face interactions, and left behind children eventually develop emotional distance and estranged relationships toward their migrant parents. So while Margaret understands her mother, she also cannot help but feel her own pain at the seemingly impenetrable distance that grows between them. Through this, Umali resists simplifying their relationship to one of pure love, longing, or even bitterness, and instead dwells in the complexity that can arise from such an arrangement, with Margaret equally missing and resenting a mother she barely knows. Margaret is also tired of everyone trying to romanticize her situation, soothe the pain by saying how brave we all are. It does nothing for the pain. When a classmate tries to interview her for a feature article on the children of outer space Filipino workers, Margaret is incensed at the way the girl frames her mother's migration. The classmate compares her mother to Greek heroes like Odysseus and asks, what compelled her mother to go all the way to outer space to serve her country? And what made her willingly want to commit such a huge sacrifice for you and the nation? Margaret scoffs at the word willingly and snaps that her mother went because she couldn't get a job in the Philippines or anywhere else in the world, and she didn't want me to starve, and the pay was really good. Like other Philippine SF stories that explore OFWs, such as Joshua Limso's Feasting, Bago Chuquianco's Humanity, and Lisa Victoria's Marte, which Lee examined in her reflection on migrant labor in Philippine SF, Umali's story also seems to push back against the Bagong Bayani narrative. The stories examined by Lee do so by exploring labor migration from the point of view of the OFW, detailing the abuse they face, which de-romanticizes the heroic nature of their work. They are not Odysseus-like figures facing challenges with skill and wit, but workers stuck in what Isanwan Jr. calls low-skilled and low-paid work. Their danger is the result of inhumane working conditions. We suggest that the OFWs themselves are likewise portrayed as outside of what can be considered traditionally heroic. And even the seemingly heroic narratives are presented in a way that is self-conscious and critical. The series girl is similarly self-conscious and critical of the hero narrative, this time from the point of view of the child left behind, who explicitly rejects the framing of a modern-day hero's journey, wherein the OFW willingly leaves home, faces trials and tribulations, and makes sacrifices so that they may return home victorious and claim their reward. Instead, Margaret brutally reminds her classmate that all the Greek heroes died at the end. Margaret also finds that she cannot reconcile the image of a hero pushed by society with the abstraction of a mother that she has in her head, as Margaret's abstraction is particularly flawed and similarly not traditionally heroic. At various points in the story, Margaret's mother yells at her for missing a call due to a solar storm, which disrupted Ansible communication. She critiques Margaret's desire to study at the University of the Philippines and belittles her chosen course, sociology. And her mother expresses homophobic views that leave Margaret deeply uncomfortable. Aside from this, Margaret spends her childhood comparing her memories of her mother's stricter parenting style to the more affectionate approach of her yaya, Adedora, who she considers to be her earth mother. All of this makes it difficult, if not impossible, for Margaret to reconcile the image of the quote woman who was brave and noble enough to work in the stars that her teachers and classmates keep trying to force on her with the mother that she has in her head. Through this, we see how the existence of spaceflight expands distance in Umali's story, not just the literal distance between Earth and Ceres, but the distance between almost all of the interpersonal connections in Margaret's life, between her and her mother, and between her and her peers, both of whom fail to understand her. There is also distance between the real Margaret and the Margaret in her mother's head, and her real mother and the mother in her head, as both identities and their relationship are continually filtered through the space that separates them, the Ansible screen, the brief window they have to speak to each other, and their own memories of the past. They remain opaque to each other, despite efforts being made on both sides. As the mother's return to Earth nears, Margaret laments that her mother's love of classical music, roses, Casablanca, are the only fragments of her mother she still knows. Time has also expanded, and that the story emphasizes not just the quantity, but the quality of the time Margaret and her mother have lost. Margaret was a child when her mother left, and is nearly an adult when her mother returns. As such, Margaret's mother did not just miss 10 years of her daughter's life, but almost the entirety of Margaret's adolescence, one of the most crucial periods of the girl's life. Margaret has not simply aged, but grown into an entirely different person in that time. This is further highlighted by Margaret's preference for the nickname Mags as she matures, while she remains Margaret in her mother's eyes and when her mother speaks to her, which leaves her to wonder whether her mother saw Margaret, not Mags, the 7-year-old who clung to her dress as she was leaving for Ceres. Neither the Ansible nor the spaceship can bridge this gap. And when Margaret's mother finally returns home, they clearly cannot regain the connection they once had. But as is characteristic of YA stories, the series girl ends on a hopeful note, allowing the possibility that they could still build their connection anew. The story also ends with a firm rejection of the valorization and seeming necessity of labor migration, asserting that there should have been another way, because it isn't fair for anyone. Elisa Victoria's Fortitude tackles similar themes and is set during the 10th anniversary of the P40I settlement, but are known as Fortitude, as the planet had to be called something pleasant. 13-year-old Sarah is left on Earth by her OFW brother. Unlike Margaret, she still romanticizes Fortitude and longs to move there because there aren't any good jobs here, so it's hard to earn money. She dreams of living on Fortitude with her family, enjoying the cool weather, the gleaming buildings, and clean streets, believing so strongly that she just needs to get out of here like her brother to be happy. Sarah's dreams of migration strongly parallel the dreams of many would-be OFWs, but the apparent answer to Sarah's problems lies not across an ocean, but across space. Fortitude is also portrayed as a kind of modern paradise. Yet the story slowly unveils that fortitude is not as pleasant as it proclaims. Fortitude means a passive sense of unyielding courage and the endurance of pain or adversity. The word is often used to praise the bravery and heroism of OFWs, and hints of the adversity faced by the Filipinos who travel to Fortitude are scattered throughout the story. While talking to Dell, a woman to whom Sarah sells a secondhand phone, Sarah shares that her brother has secured a work visa on Fortitude, though it took him a year to find a company to sponsor him, despite already possessing a master's degree. Dell points out that, like with many real-life educated OFWs who take on jobs in the service and industrial industries, advanced degrees don't really mean anything on Fortitude. Dell also reveals that she has only recently returned to Earth after working on Fortitude as a soldier, though being part of the military was never an aspiration of hers. It just happened. Sarah also sees that Dell's time as a soldier has not left her unscathed, as she notices that Dell has a transplant, a device covering her left side from the base of her neck to below her ribs, which acts as an android lung that shines a bright yellow-green, its glow pulsating with her every breath. Though Dell denies that she got her injury on the job, it is obvious to Sarah that she is lying. Dell remains tight-lipped about her work as a soldier, though her eyes look like they were mourning for somebody. Dell chooses to downplay her work and shows no pride, much less an inclination to valorize the work that she has done on Fortitude, as she openly admits she returned home due to her homesickness. In this way, it becomes clear that these futuristic OFWs do not have the easy life that Sarah envisions, and that they still serve as what Sunwon Jr. calls warm body export, now ready to be used as tools in service of humanity's exploration of space. Through Dell, Sarah also learns about the Fortitude bombing of '69, which was orchestrated by the current president of the Fourth Quadrant. During the time of the bombing, the president was a senator who was arrested for bribery, and he ordered his supporters to set off a bomb in the plaza during the anniversary celebration to divert the public's attention. After the bomb went off, a lot of people got injured, even Fortitude's own soldiers, and more than 100 died. The senator turned president's plan proved successful, and the media became so caught up in covering the bombing every night for several months that people forgot about the bribery charge, and eventually the senator got released. He later successfully ran for president. Sarah confirms that everyone on Earth believed it was an explosion from an underground gas line. Through Dell and her return to Earth, Dell's spaceflight once again expands distance, this time between the truth of Fortitude and the propagandized version that reaches Earth, thus demonstrating how the space between Earth and elsewhere can serve as a filter that can distort not only the personal, but the political, as violence and corruption are whitewashed and sanitized, a carefully planned bombing reframed as an accidental gas explosion. This, combined with Dell's own injury that was perhaps obtained during the bombing, undercuts the seemingly idyllic image of Fortitude with a layer of violence. It highlights the pain or adversity that the futuristic OFWs are forced to endure, and demonstrates that even in the far future, OFWs face the same struggles that they do now: the possibility of harassment, abuse, maltreatment, and even death. These outer-space Filipino workers are treated with carelessness, their intelligence disregarded, as is the case with Sarah's brother, as well as their safety and well-being, as is the case with the victims of the bombing. The dead and the injured are treated as collateral by a president more interested in hoarding his own consolidated wealth and power, and whose blatant corruption draws parallels to his real-life counterparts, who for 50 years now have been content to profit off migrant labor and maintain the status quo instead of working towards creating sustainable local opportunities and economic reform. However, unlike the protagonist of the series girl, Sarah still embraces the OFW narrative and is reluctant to believe that the bombing was anything other than an accident, remaining steadfast in her belief that her only hope for a better future lies in Fortitude. Through this, Victoria highlights that people in power like the fictional president have enabled a culture of such economic desperation that OFWs and their fictional counterparts must believe that they can find hope abroad because otherwise there is no escape from poverty. As Sunwon Jr. points out, even the disillusioned continue to migrate despite knowing the abuse and danger that they may face, as these would-be OFWs believe that whatever situation they may encounter abroad is still better than suffering a slow death by hunger in their beloved Philippines. In Sarah's eyes, there are no real economic alternatives to choose from. The story also never makes it clear if Sarah's brother is aware of the bombing, nor does the story explore in detail what his own situation looks like on Fortitude beyond the disregarding of his master's degree. However, it is not uncommon for migrant workers to filter or sanitize their experiences when speaking to relatives back home, both to avoid worrying their family and to use their limited screen time as respites, where they may catch up with loved ones and discuss potentially happier matters instead of reliving moments of trauma. Such filtering, however, often serves to reinforce the idealization of places like Fortitude. And according to Artajo, the reason why children of OFWs often become OFWs themselves is partially motivated by a desire to experience the sanitized version of life abroad presented to them by their loved ones. So, from Sarah's vantage point, light years away, she cannot or does not let herself see Fortitude's faults. The great distance that separates them has deliberately blunted and softened Fortitude's image, reinforced by a lifetime of propaganda. To Sarah, Fortitude continues to, quote, shine in the sky like a bright star. Sarah's stubborn hope distinguishes her from the protagonists that usually feature in many classic Anglophone spaceflight stories. Sarah is not interested in traversing space or becoming a potential intergalactic hero. She does not dream of adventure. She dreams of stability, of simply living on Fortitude with her family. In this way, Victoria captures both the social conditioning that causes Filipino youths and children of OFWs in particular to idealize labor migration and the material conditions that make them so susceptible to such conditioning in the first place. At the same time, she draws out the dark underbelly of labor migration and the ways in which the structures that enable the exploitation of migrant labor offers OFWs and would-be OFWs the illusion of choice. Fortitude is not devoid of hope, however, and instead hints at another way that Umali's protagonist wished for. In the story, Victoria points to the Philippines' potential to become the metaphorical greener pasture by making the Philippines a literal greener pasture, as nature came as a permanent settler in the neighborhood. Sarah observes a house that looked like it had given birth to a tree, and roads that vehicles no longer traversed, with fields thick with weeds and wildflowers, cats lounging on rocks. With much of humanity focused on Fortitude, no one is interested in buying land on Earth anymore. And while Filipinos' extended time away has led to the loss of urban comforts, something has also been gained, as the Earth has been left free to recover from what Sang calls the ecological deficit, an environmental overdraft brought by capitalist modes of production, which itself preys on migrant labor as a source of cheap labor. Like Margaret, the Philippines has not just changed in the 10 years since the migration to Fortitude began, but the land has transformed and emphasizes the passage of time. As nature in Victoria's Philippines thrives and reclaims space, the story suggests that Filipinos could perhaps do the same if given the chance to exist outside of the systems that propagate these exploitative labor practices in the first place. By the end of the story, Dell looks upon the Philippines with fond, hopeful eyes and realizes what Sarah has not, that this green planet with all its lucky people is a beautiful place. Overall, in both these stories, spaceflight does not so much transcend imaginative boundaries as it does in Anglophone SF, but instead serves as a conduit to explore the ways in which social and economic limitations have not only been reinforced, but expanded. In these SF stories, the Philippines is not a nation united as it flies to the stars, but a people divided by exploitative labor practices, wherein the existence of spaceflight calls attention to greater distances and the quality of time lost through extended time away. As humanity reaches for a universe brimming with possibilities and all the hope, excitement, and adventure that such possibilities may bring, the Outer-space Filipino Worker and their left-behind children in Philippine SF still come up empty-handed. Nonetheless, Fortitude and The Series Girl, as stories aimed at young adults, offer more hopeful endings compared to other Philippine SF stories, as the featured migrants are ultimately able to return home, and both point to and assert the need for alternative possibilities. The Series Girl and Fortitude, like most SF, are not meant to be prophetic, but reflective of who we are right now in the present and authorial fears about the violent, inhumane social and political worlds young people seem likely to inherit that readers must strive to avoid. As such, these stories explore and reflect the complex reality experienced by many Filipino youths, while also demythologizing OFWs as modern-day heroes to show their YA protagonists and their YA readers that working abroad is not the idyllic dream they should be working towards. These stories show that this is not the future Filipino young adults should want for themselves, whether it be 5 years from now as an overseas Filipino worker or 500 years from now as outer space Filipino workers. As such, the series Girl and Fortitude do not present these futures as foregone conclusions, but instead remind Filipino young adults that work must be done in the present if we are to make alternative futures possible. At the same time, the stories acknowledge the wider political context that shape the Filipino YA experience and that influence the way young adults negotiate their hopes and dreams for the future. In doing so, the YASF stories assert that the responsibility of thinking about and enacting alternate future possibilities are not wholly dependent on individual action. Instead, these stories suggest that, much like their teenage protagonist, the Philippines stands in an equally crucial period in the country's development, its own transition stage, as concerns about science, technology, their use and impact become more uncertain and pressing, which demand a collective reimagining of future possibilities and the present conditions that shape these futures. Through these YA stories, Filipino young adult readers are invited to and centered in such vital discussions about the future they will one day inherit. And this in turn empowers the Filipino young adult to ask, what does it mean to come of age in this age of rapidly advancing technology, both as individuals and as a people? Where might we end up? And where on Earth or otherwise do we want to be? The foreword of science fiction, Filipino fiction for young adults, describes the writers of the anthology stories as forward-looking. And these stories' redeployment of spaceflight through the reimagination of the outer space Filipino worker and their left-behind children provide Filipino young adults a safe space to imagine futures that are worth looking forward to. And these are just my references, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sydney.